Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest installment in the Quality Online Course Series. Today, we'll be talking about course activities and student engagement. And for your reference, this content today will align with the Quality Matters Standard 5. There are 4 substandards to that, and we'll talk more about that later in the workshop. But we want to focus on really what makes quality online teaching in any course. Today, we have 2 presenters for you. My name is Stephanie Richter. I'm the Assistant Director of the Faculty Development and Instructional Design Center. And I'm joined by my colleague, Tracy Miller, who is our Online Teaching Coordinator. Hello, Tracy.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Today, we also want to set some specific expectations. Because we're talking about student engagement and learner interaction and activity, we want you to be highly interactive and engaging today. So here are a few expectations that we have for you that we hope that you will be in support of. The first is that you are active participants today. That can be via text chat or audio, but we do want you to jump in. Feel free to chime in whenever you have a question or a comment to add. We do have some activities built in throughout as well, and so we hope that you'll engage and be active with those. We'd also like you to interact with one another. A critical component to any course, really, but online courses in particular, is that students are able to interact with each other so that as the presenter today, or as the faculty member teaching an online course, you aren't the only source of information. You aren't the only expert. So we do ask that as questions come up, while Tracy and I will respond to them, we'd like you to respond to each other as well and share your own experiences in practice. Or if you don't feel that you have experience to maybe answer a question, at least acknowledge the question, maybe give your take on it, or +1, agree that you would like an answer to that question as well. Just so that, again, we know that we're all here together and working together for the next 45 minutes or so. We'd also like you to reflect on the content that we will share with you today and the activities that we'll do, and think about how those apply within your own teaching and how you're learning to teach maybe a little bit more effectively online. So do please keep that in mind, that we aren't just presenting this as content for you to listen to, but we want you to really critically think about and reflect on how this will apply to your own teaching. So, are we in agreement on this? Does this sound good? If so, give me a green check mark to know that we're in agreement on these expectations and ready to have a great session today. Excellent. Well, that's enough of you at least. So I know we will have a fantastic and engaging session for the day. Wonderful. Our objectives for you are rather formally, so that by the end of today you will be able to define active learning and engagement. You may be able to do that already. We'll expect that you'll be able to describe the benefits of incorporating active learning into your courses. You'll be able to describe 3 different types of interaction that occur within a course, and that you'll be able to design your online course in a way that includes active learning components. So first, this is a question for you. What does it mean for learning to be active? I'll give you a moment to respond via the text chat. If anyone wants to give their microphone a try, just raise your hand, not physically since I can't see you, but use the buttons on the mobile app or in the Blackboard Collaborate interface to let me know that you'd like to use your microphone. But reflect for a moment and quickly share, what do you think it means for learning to be active? Excellent. I see a number of you are typing. That's what that blue sort of conversation bubble means in the participant window, by the way. That tells me that someone's typing, and that tells each other so that you know that someone is typing. So Catherine says, active learning is being able to apply knowledge in real life. That's definitely one aspect of this. Great point. Isabel, participation in discussions and projects. engaging with both colleagues and course content. Ooh, you're ahead of the game here, Isabel. We'll talk about different types of interaction, but you're definitely on point there. Active as in engaging in conversation and activities. Yes, those are both active activities. Active activities sounds redundant, doesn't it? But yes, active activities. Christy, it needs to include all students in active participation. That's great. Bill says thinking, drawing conclusions, doing something, not just listening. I would agree. And Melanie, student-centered, student-led. Ooh, student-led is a great avenue. And so I encourage you, Melanie, bring that up more as we go. Maybe offer some more insight on how you've done that or what you mean by it. And students doing thinking and processing rather than listening to the teacher. Yes. And Christy, active is highly engaged. Indeed, we talk a lot about engagement. And so I think that sometimes can cloud what we mean. Engagement sounds almost like a buzzword sometimes. But we do authentically, honestly want, I think, students to be an engaged participant, an active participant in their learning. Excellent. Before we move on, I do want to take a moment, and if something that someone else posted really struck you, please take a moment and compliment them or identify what really meant something to you out of someone else's definition.
I see more talk bubbles. Looks like we have an active group today.
Anne-Marie, yes, student-centered. Several of you mentioned student-centered. So that's great to see. And we'll bring that up later too. Great. Well, keep it coming. I definitely want to see you all interacting and engaging with one another as we go forward today. Here's a formal definition of active learning. I'm really glad that you shared your own definitions first. But so that we have a common understanding, active learning formally can be defined as any instructional method that engages students in the learning process. So now again, there's that engagement. I think as long as we mean it really authentically, honestly, it's okay. But keep in mind that it's a cover word for lots of things. But yes, that they're engaged in the learning process, which to me means that they show up mentally. Often I think we see students show up physically in a face-to-face classroom, but not necessarily mentally. And active learning requires both, that they're there, they're engaged, and they're doing. And then the second part of this definition is that students participate in meaningful learning activities. I'm going to pause for a second there because I think that's an important part of this definition. Quite often when we choose activities that get students moving or engaging because we think there should be an activity, but it's activity for activity's sake. I think back to, I taught math courses, and there were times when we would have students do a problem not because it had meaning, but just to do something, or talk to your neighbor about something, not because it had a purpose to it, just because someone told me I'm supposed to change things up every 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever I was told. And so I do that without real meaning behind it. And here, that means something that's meaningful, significant, and relevant to students. The second part of this is then that they reflect on what they are doing. And reflection can be formal or informal. I think it's mostly a state of mind. And truthfully, I think that what we learn is really what we reflect on, what we think about, that just listening to something, even in math, when I taught math, even just routinely doing a problem algorithmically is not learning. It's functioning, you're doing something. But if you aren't really reflecting and thinking on it, I don't think that we really learn. So I'd love your thoughts on that, on the role of reflection, whether it's a formal reflection or informal habits of thought, maybe. But I would love your thoughts on that too as we go forward, on the role of reflection and thinking about what we learn. Melanie adds, students need to actually do the teaching or explaining rather than just doing it. Yes, explaining it to someone else really can show that you understand. Great point, Melanie. Thank you. I have several, I like to call these audacious claims, where I don't have evidence to support them. I just, experience has taught this to me. And the first one is that if you're going to have an active learning environment, if you call it active learning, it really has to be student-centered in order for that to work. And several of you already brought up, and Marie even pointed out that most of us had brought up student-centered in some format. And what I mean by student-centered is that you think of students first. You think about what their experience is like. You think about what they need to be successful, what supports they need. You think about what students should be doing, thinking about accessing reading instead of what you are doing first. So by putting students first, then what you do sort of lines up behind that. So that's my first audacious principle here. Active learning environments must be student-centered. And I don't say that because I think we aren't student-centered, but because we need to keep that in mind and make a commitment to that for an active learning environment. The second one is that in active learning environments, students must be responsible and accountable, I would say, for their own learning. Now that doesn't mean that they learn on their own, because I also don't think that we do a great job of that, of learning independently. I think that as human beings, we all generally learn better when we're connected to one another. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to talk about it or that we have to be in the same room, but I do think that individually we have to take that responsibility to learn. This is more challenging, I think, for us as faculty for being student-centered, because we can make that commitment. This one we need students to make the commitment to. We can do that by setting expectations, by providing support and a framework to get them started with. But ultimately, for students to really be successful in an active learning environment, they need to understand that they don't learn because we lecture to them. They don't learn because they read the book. They learn because they have done something with that information or reflected or thought about it. So keep that in mind too, and if you have strategies for how you have helped students take responsibility and be an active leader in their own learning and in the learning of their classmates, please do share those. Someone earlier, was it Melanie or Anne? I'm going to forget. Melanie, who said that it's student-led. I would love for you to expand upon that now in the text chat. Since I've made the claim and you've made the claim, if you have a strategy for that, please do share it. I'm going to move on though while you do that. We'll come back to it. So there are 3 types of basic interaction in your course, in any course that you can build in. And that interaction occurs between faculty, students, and the content of the course. The way that you design your course can take advantage of these connections or can inhibit those connections. My preference, of course, my belief, and the research has shown that in high-quality online courses, you take advantage of as many of these connections and components as you can. So the first interaction I want to highlight is between faculty and student. This is the traditional learning paradigm, I think, where in a face-to-face course, your interaction with students happens when you're in the front of the classroom. It happens when you work with students one-on-one. But these are some of the types of interaction that you might engage with. For example, you do simple things like giving students reminders and announcements about what's coming up in the course, what has changed in the course, where they should be focusing. You answer their questions, you encourage them and mentor them. But one of the key ways that you interact with students is by giving them feedback on their learning, whether that is pre-scripted. For example, if you have a quiz where they get feedback based on their score, they know where they need to work more, or on longer assignments where you provide more qualitative feedback. However you do that, your feedback to students on what they're learning and how they're learning is incredibly valuable. For students, they'll interact with you when they're listening to you, certainly, but they'll also ask you clarifying questions about the course content or the materials, the assignments, the expectations, and give you feedback on the course design overall, as well as students interact with you when they provide you evidence of their learning. Some tips for perhaps making that a little bit easier. I'm not talking about specific strategies yet or specific tools, but mostly to smooth the interaction as a flow, is for one, to model the behavior you want out of students. If you want them to behave in a certain way, discuss in a certain way, make sure that you're modeling that as well. And then set clear expectations for the etiquette of interacting with you. If you have a specific title you want to be called, or a specific method or strategy for email communication, for example, you can make that explicitly clear to students at the beginning so that they know how to respond to you. And then also plan for providing feedback on students' learning, and let them know how are you going to give them feedback, when are you going to give them feedback, what type of feedback do you offer as a matter of course, or what type of feedback could they ask for. For example, I think about when we're grading essays, I think it's our tendency to give a lot of feedback, but not all students want that. So you could scale back the amount of feedback you give, but let students know that if they want more, all they need to do is ask, or set up time for office hours to give feedback, etc. And then also, I think it's important to set expectations for response time, for when you'll get back to them and how you'll get back to them. Melanie, I love all the detail you gave. We're going to come to that in a second. So keep that up. If you're in the session now, go ahead and give it a quick read. And I will summarize it when I talk about it for those of you watching the archive. The second type of interaction is between students and content. And again, this is where we expect learning to happen. Students can read content, they may watch a video or a tutorial for online, but for an active learning environment, you really want to push farther and look at how students engage with the content to do something or discover something. This ties in a little bit to the student-led, to that discovery process. They also need to process it, reflect on it, think about it, and apply it in new settings. And as you're selecting content and sequencing content, beyond just informing students, I think it's important to think about how the content motivates, inspires, and challenges students to do more. Our textbooks, some textbooks are much more motivating than others. And if a textbook is not motivating, how do you find additional content for students to engage with in ways that will motivate, inspire, and challenge them? And I'm going to tie into a little bit of what Melanie said here, probably a little bit more in a second. Primarily where she says she gives students choice in what they want to learn or how they learn it, providing a structure, the overall content for each class session, and then letting them select a book or topic they want to engage with. To me, that's a great example of students engaging with content in a deeper and more engaging way. Simply making that choice, as Tracy points out, the choice being a motivator, and really giving students a deeper ownership of what they're learning. Looking at all the different options for what they learn, thinking about processing and reflecting on what they really want to learn, and then choosing how to go about doing that is a fantastic way to engage students with this interaction between themselves and the content. Not as a static body of knowledge that you've identified, but a living, breathing body of work that they can become part of instead of just an external observer. That's not a strategy for every course. It's not possible for every course. But when it is, when you have that opportunity, even as one portion of your course, to allow students to specialize in some way, I think it's a great way to motivate and engage students and really make them more active participants in their own learning. I'm going to get to the second half in the next portion of this, actually, Melanie. So in looking at student-to-content interaction, it's important to consider several things. And I would refer you, if you're looking for more insight on content and instructional materials, that we recently held a workshop like this one on learning materials and instructional materials and course content, I think is what it was called, which is archived and available on the website so that you can see more of our suggestions around using content and instructional material in your course. But using a variety of content types means that students can engage in different ways with different types of content. It's also important to incorporate opportunities for students to practice the content, whether that is a low-stakes assessment like a practice quiz, a short simulation or activity online, a discussion with one another, or a reflection. Those low-stakes opportunities to practice can be very helpful. And then when you establish content to students, you should set expectations for the activities that they should do, why they're doing those and how those support their learning. Provide schedules and plans so that it's very clear to students what they should be doing at what time. And give them information on how those activities support the learning objectives. What are they gaining by participating in this discussion, or doing this quiz, or trying this simulation out online, or reading this book, or writing this reflection paper? What are those different activities accomplishing? So then the third type of interaction is actually among students themselves. And at this point, it's about that social construct of learning, that we learn better when we have a support network to work with. So we have others who we can ask and clarify and grow together, who we can discuss with and collaborate with on deeper learning projects, but also whom we know and just naturally feel part of as a community. And in online courses, this can be challenging because students don't come together. In a face-to-face course, students naturally talk to each other in the hallway or when they first come into class, although I think that's decreasing now that they're connected outside of the students who are in the class, and they don't tend to bring those connections naturally into the classroom anymore. So building those opportunities is a great strategy for increasing students' capacity to learn and making them feel more comfortable in the learning environment. So for student-to-student interaction, you really want to build that community and do it deliberately and intentionally. You want to include opportunities for social learning as well, for learning who one another are, whether that's an icebreaker or a more structured activity of community building, but also to engage off-topic, to talk about plans for spring break, or talk about something big that happened in the news on the web that might relate to the content or might just relate to them culturally. And then for student-to-student interaction, set expectations. I liked Melanie's example of having students find a creative way to present what they have learned to the class. So they are interacting with one another, but in a structured format, in addition to the informal, unstructured format. And using Socratic seminars, where students read the same thing, set discussion guidelines, as Melanie points out, and take charge to facilitate discussions, student-led discussions online. And student-led presentations in online courses are great motivators and great ways to make them more active. The difficult thing is what Melanie says last, to take a back seat yourself and contribute to redirect, reframe, and guide discussion instead of leading it. That can be very challenging because it's a new role for you to take on as well. So within these three types of interaction, I want to point out that we have actually engaged in a lot of this already today. A lot has been faculty to student, if you put me into that faculty role, conversing with you, and you contributing back to me. You've certainly been engaging with the content as you listen to me, you watch the slides, and you actively think and reflect on what meaning we're going through today. And I've asked you to think about that application side too, how this applies to what you're doing in your classes. And then we've been encouraging you to engage in student-to-student interaction as well by supporting one another. In fact, I'm going to call out, since she just posted it, Melanie asks, can anyone recommend a favorite online platform for synchronous chat? If you have one, if you're here today and you have one, please post your comments, or if you've tried something that you know didn't work the way you wanted it to, post that as well. Tracy or I will chime in a little bit, but I want to give you guys opportunities to support
It's really
one
hard
another
to take a back seat and not contribute to this.
And you mentioned GroupMe as an option. I'm going to ask you if you could, I know you're on the tablet, so it's not the easiest to type, but explain more about what that is for Melanie as a resource while we go on a little bit here too. The last point I want to leave you with before I turn you over to Tracy is to think about active learning strategies as a continuum. Some of these can be really simple. For example, I'll start with that pause for reflection. In an online session like this, just simply pausing to give you a chance to think is an example of starting to incorporate active learning strategies and push the responsibility back to you as the learner. Whereas you can have at the upper right corner very complex, structured active learning strategies as well. So Tracy will have some specific recommendations around how you incorporate active learning strategies. But start thinking about some of these now that you may already use face-to-face or online, and find maybe some suggestions from what she'll share for other ways that you can incorporate active learning in your courses. Tracy, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's move on to moving beyond what we could do and should do, and maybe start incorporating some of these active learning strategies into our online courses. So that's what we're going to talk about for sort of the second half of our time together this afternoon. So again, I'm still expecting lots of activity, lots of interaction. So I hope everybody's still feeling good and active. So one of the strategies that we're going to start with is identifying activities in which you feel it already really helps the students get it. So there's some things that you're already doing that, you know, you're thinking about doing things a little differently. But you know what? If they're already working, then let's keep doing them. For instance, we find in our sessions that we do online that this idea of polling people really works well. It's fairly simple to use. Most of the technology supports it. And so, you know, we want to make sure we keep this opportunity to poll out there because it already works really well for us. The second strategy is whatever it is you want the students to be able to do, give them opportunities to do it. So if there's a certain skill that you're building or a certain application of an idea that you want your students to be able to do, make sure that you give them some action steps to get there. And then the final one is to give students time to make meaning, and this is getting back to that idea of reflection. So I went over those really quick, but that's because I'm going to take some time to break them down a little bit individually. So I pulled up Stephanie's slide again with the active learning strategies in this continuum or this spectrum idea about how you can come up with ideas that go from simple to complex. But I'm going to use this as an example of something that maybe you're already doing and it's just an activity that your students love and, you know, they derive so much meaning behind. And so in this case, I'm going to talk a little bit about a role-playing activity. And I think, role playing, it's way up there on the complex list, but it's something that we can all identify. Maybe it's even been one of our favorite activities. We love using it in our courses already. So I'm going to break this one down a little bit. This is an activity that I put together in order to show you how it could actually look as you're building course activities into your Blackboard course. And so I was thinking, okay, I did some research on role playing and how I could put together an activity. And so I kind of compiled a few ideas that I had seen and came up with this particular activity, and it's called the Community Health Role Play. So what it is asking the students to do is to break into groups of 3, and they're all going to get a different role. They're going to be a scientist, a public health official, and a community leader. And so as I'm putting this together, and I think this is really fun, and the students are really going to get what I want them to get out of it, I'm thinking, okay, what do I want them to get out of it? And so then I want to draw your attention to, when you're putting together these activities, make sure you're just really clear about how this aligns with the learning objectives. And of course, if you've been to one of our sessions already, we're going to tie this back to the Quality Matters rubric. But one of the most important things is that this idea of alignment and everything is sort of going to fit together. So in this case, this learning activity is going to align with Learning Objective 3. Students will be able to create a community health plan which addresses the needs of multiple stakeholders. I've also broken it down even more specifically in saying that this addresses a module level objective for preparing a meeting for multiple stakeholders, creating an action plan, assessing the health needs of a community. Again, I was just sort of making all of these up in order for to kind of show you a really practical example of a learning activity. But what are the other things you want to do when you make sure you've created a course activity? Is that it aligns with your assessments, and there's that specific connection to the assessments also. So I've just made it really clear. Now this activity, honestly, you may grade it or you may not grade it. It may become an assessment. But just to make it really clear that this particular activity will prepare you for the final presentation at the health fair. So that's sort of the motivation, right? Even though it sounds really fun and it would be really informative to kind of participate in this activity, students are still motivated if they know they're going to be graded at some point, and so kind of tying that to an assessment. We want to make sure it's active. And I think role-playing is inherently active. It's got acting in it, you're playing out a part. But whenever you create any kind of activity, I just love the idea of saying it has an action plan. Just sort of putting that descriptor in front of it is saying, okay, this is where we're going to get active, and kind of clues the students into this area. The next part that I want to point out here is that we want to be really intentional that there's some sort of interaction in there. Maybe beyond the obvious that there's some kind of content to student interaction. In this case, because the students would be broken into teams, when I created this activity, I gave them a group or a team activity area and told them that they would be working in teams and that they would have plenty of collaborative tools at their disposal in order to have their own kind of student-to-student interaction, and that they should definitely take advantage of the tools. But one of the things I want to point out in this one too is they may wish to use their own sort of tools. And that kind of goes back to the idea of having choice and allowing them for students to be self-directed, and you don't have to use these tools. They're available to you, but you can also definitely find your own tools that work for you. But we want to make sure that when we support students in team building and projects of this sort, that we help them in the way of maybe constructing a team contract. So if everyone decides, or more importantly, I guess, if someone decides they're going to use a Google Hangout instead of something built into Blackboard, that it's understood that the team all understands that this is going to be the way that they interact, and they're all on board with it, and they're sort of all in agreement with it. The final piece is over here, and Stephanie definitely talked about this with response time and feedback. To just be really clear with the students in how you're going to respond to them. Maybe you're going to take that back seat with the group area and any of the collaboration tools that they use. But in this case, your participation, your interaction is going to be the response and the feedback that you give to them with their journals. And in this case, I've incorporated several different journal prompts in order to have the students not just kind of loosely reflect on what's happening as they're engaging in this activity, but being a little bit more structured and intentional about what I want them sort of reflecting on and thinking about as they go through this activity. So I really haven't given you a lot of chance to interact in this slide. But I will, coming up, I promise. I want to take a quick peek at the text chat to see if there's any activity over there. But I do want to ask you if you'd like to take some time to type some things out while I go over the next slide. I'm interested in knowing if there's any of those favorite activities that you've tried that have been really active, and you feel the students just sort of get it when you actually use these activities in your course. So type away in the text chat if you have some ideas to share with the rest of us. And then, of course, remember to respond to each other, even with clarifying questions. Maybe there's a point that they're making that, you just like a little bit more detail on. So, again, feel free to kind of interact in the text chat as I talk about the next slide a little bit. So the next strategy that I went over was that idea that if there's something that you want your students to be able to do, make sure you provide them opportunities to do this. And so I pulled out an old favorite book of mine, and that was written by D. Fink, and it's called Creating Significant Learning Experiences. And he has actually written a lot and has done professional development on this idea of significant learning experiences, and it's really all kind of wraps around this idea of active learning. And one of the things he really highlights on is that there's many different ways that there are activity and engagement in a course, and there's three of them that he usually highlights: ideas and information and ideas, experience, and reflecting. And I have adapted this chart. If you look at his normal chart, you'll see that he has a third category. He has this direct, indirect, and then he also has this third row, which is called online. And to me, I can't separate them anymore. Some of the things that I felt that were added to the online portion, I just put right into the other portions, and it still worked just fine. But students will be engaged in content, and this is sort of the textbook or the lecture or primary sources or data that they've gathered. This is how they are gathering information or ideas that come from a direct source. And so if that is something that they are consuming directly, then there's a couple ways that they can become more active in the course by experiencing those sources in some way. And so what they may be doing is they may be asked to do something real or in an authentic setting. Maybe they're actually taking that data that they've gathered and now they're using it in a way that would actually be used in an authentic setting. If we go back to my example and we were talking about kind of participating in a role-playing activity, maybe in a real activity, they would actually be attending a community meeting on a particular health issue and kind of gathering their own data and then kind of experiencing it in an authentic setting. And then there's this idea of observing. And when you first see observing, you may be tempted to think, well, isn't that getting back to a more passive experience? But I love the way Fink describes this because this is an observation of a phenomenon. And so what always pops into my head with this is that this could be going to a play or experiencing orchestra or even watching you do a demonstration of a chemical reaction. So, you know, they're not doing the chemical reaction, but at least at this point they are observing that phenomenon and it just makes the connections a little bit closer to them. But then we have the indirect or the vicarious ways of doing things. And so, you know, you can read down the list, but, you know, this is where they're not getting the primary source, but now they're getting some secondary sources of information. And, you know, that could be your lecture, your textbooks, or even just some other sources that they're finding out there. So how do we take that maybe instructional material and now we're making it into more of a way they can be active or experience it? I see some activity over here, so I want to make sure I address it. Christy said, I have created a course-specific Facebook page that is student-run. They find videos, articles, current event stories relevant to the unit topics. They interact 24/7 since they are always on it. That is a great idea. And you know what? That gets back to the idea of social learning because there's just so much that we can give them. And then there's just so many other resources that they're finding and using. So I think that's a great idea. Anne-Marie asked if it was a private page, and so Christy answered her. So thank you so much for that interaction. Just for the tape, I'm going to say that Christy did say it is private. They request permission to join, and I will allow that since you're the administrator. So that kind of protects the page and the integrity of the page. So I think that's a great solution right there. Thank you for sharing that. So getting back to just a couple examples of how you may be able to experience some of this indirect. And in this case, these examples are pretty straightforward, but using case studies, creating case studies, or in the, kind of the observing side here, observing the stories or the videos of what others are saying about a particular piece of content or even a particular piece of secondary data and how they're interpreting and analyzing some of this information that they're indirectly consuming as students. So then this final area is that taking time to reflect. And I think we think about reflection being very internal, being very self, and it definitely could. And there's a couple different ways that as faculty and instructors, we can give our students kind of tools to allow them to be able to do some self-reflecting. But I'm curious if anyone has ever thought about the fact that you are sort of reflecting with others if you're talking about some of these ideas over here where they're discussing, even creating term papers, maybe sharing that information with you or with each other. Okay, so Stephanie is continuing on with the idea of social learning, and Christy says it also serves as an informal meeting place for them to socialize. Yes, so they're coming together as a community because they're socializing in a different environment that allows them to be a little bit more informal that way. So I'd like you to think about other ways that students might be reflecting with others, and please feel free to enter anything into the text chat area. But I wanted to show you my sample, my practical example of ways you can provide your students with opportunities to do things. So I stayed on that same train talking about contemporary health issues. And so the first thing I want you to do is I want you to put your student hat on, okay? So you're no longer leading the course, designing the course, facilitating the course. Now you're the student, and you pop open this activity into the course, and it's on health and disease, and here it is in front of you. The first thing I want to ask you is, do you know how this aligns with learning objectives and assessments? And don't just tell me yes or no. If you could give us a little description of where you're seeing it in the course activity. And you can type it in the text chat. You can use your microphone, or I believe, have I given participants the option to use the whiteboard? Let's see. Whiteboard permission off. Okay. Raise your hand if you'd like to use the whiteboard, and I will turn it on for you. Okay, Anne-Marie, you can use the whiteboard. Do you know how to use the whiteboard? There's actually a control panel right next to the left-hand side. Either one, Anne-Marie. If you'd rather put it in the text chat, that's fine too. Okay, so I'm assuming no one, oh, wait a minute. The assignment, Catherine says, the assignment description for your own views on health illustrates an opportunity for reflection. Okay, I would agree that that gives you an idea about how students have opportunities for reflection. How about the learning objectives? Okay, so Anne-Marie says the interactions are in the activities such as Learning Activity 1. So Learning Activity 1 is a discussion board, and so that definitely shows some student-to-student interaction. The discussion of the causes of the illness as an objective. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Isabel? Okay, and then she's writing that in. I'm going to point this out at the very top. My attempt of aligning the learning objectives and assessment was to just really make it really clear. This activity aligns with learning objective 4 and 5. And I also talk about the fact that this activity will prepare you for the community survey assessment and final presentation at the health fair. So what I was hoping is you would know how this aligned with the learning objectives and assessments because it was just really clearly stated in the description of the activity. I think you were all trying to kind of infer what it was, and I think you were making really good connections with the learning objectives and the assessments. But what Quality Matters is looking for is that you make really clear statements on how they align with learning objectives and assessments. So don't try to make it too hard on yourselves out there. I think we've already talked a little bit where there are some interactions and where there are some opportunities for reflective learning. And we only have a few minutes left, so we're just going to go past motivation a little bit here on why students would want to do this activity. But I want to really quickly talk about how reflection gives students opportunities to make meaning about things. And so make sure that you not only allow them to make meaning by interacting with each other socially, like we were sort of suggesting with the great idea with the Facebook page, that you allow them time to make meaning, okay? So give them the space, don't just put it as an afterthought, and hopefully as we've been weaving this interaction throughout the time with you this afternoon, you've had time to kind of process and make meaning of what we've been talking about here. But to make sure that we really give you time to reflect, please consider this as you continue on your day, and maybe as you have graded 150 papers and now you want to talk about how you can incorporate some more active learning strategies in it. Think about these two reflection prompts in here. Active learning strategies you plan to use or interactions that you will promote in your classroom. Isabel, thanks for following up and clarifying for the group what you were thinking about with the discussion boards. And finally, to kind of wrap things up in the last 60 seconds that we have, I want to make sure we do really clearly tie this into the Quality Matters rubric that we've been adopting here at NIU. And we've broken it down into how the substandards are articulated in the rubric. Quality courses provide students with opportunity to engage in active learning activities for promote the achievement of learning objectives, that's 5.1, that foster interaction with you, the other students, and the content that supports active learning, that's 5.2, with a clearly communicated faculty response time in conjunction with the faculty feedback plan. Stephanie talked a lot about that. That's 5.3. And then it's along with interactive requirements for engagement. That was actually one of the first slides we showed you today when we told you what our expectations were, and that's 5.4. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon and being so engaging. And I'm just going to throw up the summary for you to read as I continue to thank you for supporting our quality online course series. We've been seeing a lot of familiar faces, and it's great to see everyone so engaged and so committed to their students. And then finally, if you would like to reach out to Stephanie and I, we are here for you. We're here for you next week for all kinds of support, and here is our contact information. Take care, everyone, and try to stay warm. Weather's looking better for next week. And we will definitely hang out for questions for a little while. Thanks, Stephanie, for putting the survey link in there.
There are no questions right away. I'm going to stop the recording for the night, or for the day.
Sounds good.